I'm Steve Mann, and this is Paper Classroom. Welcome to another history tutorial. In this particular video, we're going to talk about Eastern raw materials. So we're talking about raw materials that were used in the Far East and the Middle East in the early days of papermaking. We're also going to look at why these materials changed, why they started using different materials for making paper. So we'll quickly just have a look at the drivers for these changes. First of all, geography. You don't grow the same plants everywhere in the world. So as papermaking moved, then there was a need to use what were local plants or local sources of raw materials or even local chemicals. Another one is the volume demand. Whatever your raw material is, there has to be enough of it to meet the demand to make that particular type of paper, or you have to change raw materials. The third of the four drivers is performance requirements. You need the paper to perform, to do certain jobs, and therefore you may need to either change the fibre that you use, or maybe you need to put some chemical treatment in place to improve the performance. And finally, environmental factors. And by environmental factors, I'm not just talking about pollution. It may be a case of using someone else's waste as your raw material. So, prior to 105 AD, prior to Cylon writing all this down, typical raw materials for making paper in China were the old fishing ropes, because they were made from hemp, which is a long fibre. So nets that have been abandoned were a good source of fibre, good example of recycling. They were using the offcuts from silk production, the bits that were left over, as well, of course, as using the inner bark from the paper mulberry tree. And probably the addition of the paper mulberry tree was one of Cylon's contribution. And remember, although paper in some form was made before 105 AD, Cylon is credited with it just because he wrote down the technique for turning fibres or raw materials into individual fibres and then into a sheet of paper. So this is one of his biggest contributions, the introduction of the bark from the paper mulberry tree. And why should he choose that? Well, he chose that because there were plenty of mulberry trees around. And why were there plenty of mulberry trees around? Because one of the things that China was most famous for was silk production. And of course, silk comes from silkworms. And amazingly, the only thing in the world that silkworms will eat are mulberry leaves. They will eat nothing else. No one has ever been able to tempt them to eat anything else other than mulberry leaves. So because of the silk production, there was plenty mulberry trees around, therefore plenty mulberry bark. Of course, they started to introduce other fibres. On the top right there, you see we've got bamboo, and on the left we've got a plant called rami. Rami is also known as China grass, and it comes from the nettle family, but that also has quite long fibres. Now, we mentioned in an earlier video about the Chinese armies and the Muslim armies clashing, particularly at the Battle of Talas, which was on the river Talas in the Samarkand area. The Muslims won, and they took with them some slaves from the Chinese army, and some of those slaves knew how to make paper. And this was the very first real big breakout of papermaking from China. And the Samarkand area became a big centre of making paper. Now, of course, there wasn't a lot of bamboo in Samarkand. There was no mulberry in Samarkand. And so they turned to the materials that they grew in large quantities. And they were growing hemp and they were growing flax. Hemp for things like ropes, flax to turn into clothing. So it was an obvious choice to see if these sort of fibres could be used for making paper. It was during that time that they also discovered the importance of good, clean water for making paper. The better quality of the water, the better quality of the finished type of paper. While we're on the topic of raw materials, it's worth mentioning again Japan. So in 1031 AD, what did Japan do? They actually wrote down the fact that they used old paper to make new paper. So this is the very first example in the world of recycling of paper-making fibres. Of course, when they make fibre the first time, then sorry, not fibre. When they make a sheet of paper the first time, then the paper looks like this, and it will be a yellowy, creamy colour. Then they write on it with their jet black pigmented inks, and when they no longer need that paper anymore, what do? They mash it up and make a fresh piece of paper. But then you get it like this, because the ink is still there. They'd not developed the technology for removing ink, and therefore two grades of paper came about. Paper made from or first generation paper made from brand new fibres, and recycled paper or second generation paper made from old paper. So the old paper was a greyish colour, and the new paper was a sort of yellowy, creamy colour. It's worth just mentioning chemicals here as an introduction for videos that we'll show later on. But when the Chinese wrote on their papers, sometimes the ink did not stay in a precise line. Sometimes it wicked out a little bit to the side, and we call that feathering. And one of the things that they tried to do was today what we call sizing. They tried to change the surface or the nature of the surface of the paper. And one of the ways they did that was by using rice water. So you've taken a pan of rice, you've boiled it for ages, you've got the rice to eat, but the water is cloudy because some of the starch has dissolved. So they took their sheet of paper that they've made and dried, and then they painted it with this rice water and then re-dried it. And they did that in an attempt to try and stop the wicking of the ink. They found that it wasn't particularly successful. They did find, however, it improved the strength of the sheet, and that's why today we do use starch for improving the strength of paper, but we don't really use starch as a material for producing sizing effects. Well, that's enough of this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching. Please enjoy our other videos, and please comment on the videos that we make so we can make improvements. Thank you very much again.